usually the things that are the weakest in the body are the ones that are going to take the brunt of the damage when something big happens. So, especially if it's systemic, meaning it's delivered body-wide.
Mold illness can be an overwhelming topic. The good thing is that you're not alone. Join Dr. Lauren Tessier, a mold illness specialist, as she helps to demystify this complex world. Welcome to Your Life After Mold. We're so glad you're here.
This podcast is for educational purposes only and does not provide medical, legal, or professional advice. Listening does not create any professional or client relationship between the host, guests, or affiliated entities and the listener. For advice specific to your circumstances, consult a qualified professional. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not represent the views of the host or affiliated entities. By accessing this podcast, you agree to indemnify and hold harmless the hosts, guests, and affiliated entities from any claims, damages, or liabilities arising from your use of the information provided. Hi, everybody. Dr. Lauren Tessier here, and I'm so glad you are joining me for the first ever Life After Mold podcast episode. Now, this episode, the whole point of this is to have a really just well-rounded introductory episode, so that way you can get to know who I am. You can get to know why I'm doing this. And of course, you can also get some of the most common questions that many people have about mold exposure, mold-related illness, all answered before we get into the really meaty parts of this upcoming season of this podcast. So without further ado, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So as I mentioned, I'm Dr. Lauren Tessier. I am a licensed naturopathic physician. I was trained at Tessier University, just outside of Seattle, at a doctorate program in naturopathic medicine. There was a wonderful time, and I eventually headed back east to New England, where I was born and raised. And I ended up in Vermont. And in that little town where I landed in Vermont, in Waterbury, landed after a Hurricane Irene. And the downtown was was still recovering. It was recovering from a lot of flooding, a lot of water damage. Now, unbeknownst to me at that time, I had no clue. We weren't really taught about mold in school. Nothing was really elucidated to us regarding that other than maybe allergy. And so I found myself in situations where a lot of the naturopathic treatments that we would do with folks, like basic level stuff for fatigue and brain fog, they just weren't sticking. They weren't working the way we typically would expect them to, which then opened up this whole entire world of mold and the possibility of water damage causing some of these underlying issues, these really resistant to treatment symptoms. So I ended up falling down the moldy rabbit hole there. And of course, during that time, I then eventually found myself in a moldy situation. And then as more and more time progressed from there, and upon reflecting back on my history, I had family members who had passed from severe autoimmune disorders who had also lived in severely moldy environments. So, that ended up being this whole thing of spurring me forward. Now, I ended up, going through the whole concept of, urine mycotoxin protocols, and then eventually sat for my CIRS certification in 2016. And then after that, I went on to help grow and develop ICI, the International Society of Environmentally Acquired Illness, which is an educational nonprofit that teaches physicians essentially how to do what I do and what other mold illness physicians do. And there we also bring together indoor environmental professionals too. So it's a really nice collegiate group of people from a few different fields that are integral to helping people recover from mold illness. So there, at that time is probably about 2017. I'd been in practice for about 4 years, pretty much treating some form of mold illness from the get-go, right out of the gate. But at that point is when I started teaching and lecturing and speaking and doing all of that kind of outreach, and just kind of never looked back. Eventually, I opened up Life After Mold which is my educational consultant business to help people recover from mold illness. And then I also operated or I still do operate a medical practice that takes on clients for care for medical treatment for mold related illness. So the process has been amazing. I learn so much every year. Clients teach me so much. And then also in my process of lecturing and teaching, I learn so much, which I think is my favorite part. I spend way too much time in the medical literature and the human literature, the animal literature, just learning about all things mold and mycotoxins. And I'm just always blown away by how much more comes up year after year and how many more like small and intricate connections can be made. And so, that's where I am. And I should say, I was in a situation in 2023 where Vermont was once again hit with historic flooding. And my office, unfortunately, suffered severe water damage up to the rafters underneath my subfloor. All of my office items became severely contaminated. And it was at that point I realized that I could not safely run an office for my clients or myself out of that space or using any of the items that were in that space. So essentially, in the summer of 2023, I lost the office that I had built 10 years, blood, sweat, and tears, putting it all back in. So once again, to mold and water damage, essentially. So when I tell people that, I've gone through it firsthand, I've gone through it many iterations firsthand, and some of them more traumatic than others. So when I tell people that I truly wholeheartedly know and understand, I very much do. So with all that being said, now you know a bit about me, and I would love to get into talking about my goals here with this podcast. So in general, the process of going through mold, being exposed, falling ill, it's a traumatic process. Not only are you sick, scared, probably brain fogged, confused, but then the space that's supposed to offer you the most safety, your home, your den of comfort, your safe space, it suddenly becomes not safe. And there's so many different that in and of itself is beyond traumatic. I'm sorry, I'm going to keep using the words trauma here, but being sick, losing your safe space, the cost of all of it, the loss of time, there's so many aspects to it that are traumatic, but also really isolating, very, very isolating. And people feel very alone in this process. And that can be the result of many different things, including people not taking them seriously, or people hearing mold and thinking that it's a 4-letter word, like there must be something wrong with you, or you did something to cause this, or like that it's very, has a lot of judgment and a lot of weight behind it. And so watching people day after day navigate this, I don't want people to be in a vacuum of sadness and trauma and isolation with this. I want people to know that this happens to so many people, whether or not people even realize it, right? And I just want to bring certain things to the forefront. The other thing I want to do with this podcast is I want to bring forth experts in the field to come together and talk about not only what they do that they love and they're passionate about, but then how we can tie it into mold. Because while mold in and of itself can cause a lot of different illnesses, and we can talk a bit about that, it can also interface with so many different illnesses, meaning, it's almost this 6 degrees of separation. I feel like you can tie anything back to mold exposure or draw a connection between mold and mycotoxin exposure and heart disease or mold and mycotoxin exposure and insomnia, or mold and mycotoxin exposure and like B12 anemia. There's always these little connections that can be had. And not all of them are connections that are a cause, but they could be a correlation or an exacerbation, or, it's just really exciting to see all these different connections. And the unfortunate thing is that a lot of patients find themselves stuck in these loops of detox, binder, glutathione, detox, binder, glutathione, and they don't get anywhere, you know? So that's the goal here, is to try to break that cycle of the same mold talking points over and over and over again, and really get into some I think it's rad. I'm going to date myself. I think it's rad. Really get into some rad concepts in the world of mold and mold related illness. So in order to get into those rad concepts, what I have to do right now here with you is I need to answer some of the most common basic questions. So then when you're ready to kind of rock and roll, you can hop right into those episodes for those advanced discussions, because you already have the foundations with this one. So let's get into it. What is mold? Mold is an organism. It can be, typically molds are multicellular, meaning that they're lots of little cells that come together to make a mold. And then there are yeasts, which are single cellular. Both are fungi, and they exist in something called the fungi kingdom. So if you remember back to basic biology, we have the plant kingdom, the animal kingdoms, the fungi kingdom, etc. And so when we're talking about mold and mold-related illness, we're doing a little bit of interchange here. Even though molds are the multicellular ones, sometimes we'll throw in, just like the discussion of yeasts into it. It's not perfect. Could it be fungal-related illness? It's probably a better term, but no one really ever classifies the mold growth in their home as fungi. They classify it as mold. So that's kind of the loose terminology that we're using here. And so molds are everywhere. Absolutely. And they only really become, though, a significant problem when there is too much in one single space. And I have people picture, that idea of when you have a fish and you feed it a little bit and the fish is fine. But then you have your little kid who comes over and dumps in the whole entire bottle of fish food. And then suddenly the water's dirty and the fish can become sick. What matters is the concentration of the spores around the person. So yes, mold's everywhere, of course. However, it's really realistically how much the person is exposed to by breathing it over and over and over again on a day-to-day basis. And then there's mycotoxins. Mycotoxins are the secondary metabolites that molds make. They're just there. They make them, sometimes they think that, or researchers think that it could be a virulence factor, meaning it helps make whatever the molds are trying to infect easier to infect. We see them as a potential defense mechanism for them to battle off their niche so they can claim their stake. But no matter what we do know about mycotoxins that are produced by molds and yeasts is that they cause a lot of significant damage throughout the body. And that is one of the aspects of mold-related illness. Where is mold found in homes? Mold can be found anywhere in a home. It can be found anywhere that there is water, anywhere that there is what I call the 3Ds, dust, dirt, dander, or debris, and potentially poor ventilation. Now, realistically, you can have relative low humidity, so not a lot of water, and you can still have molds that grow. So realistically, molds are going to grow anywhere that there's their food, that organic matter, again, that dust, dirt, dander, and debris. So literally they can happen in any part of the home, anywhere that there's wood or paper or all that dust and dirt, and anywhere that there's a little bit of humidity added. Doesn't have to be much. So realistically, molds can happen anywhere in the home. And different molds are going to have, because different molds have different predilections towards different amount of water. Certain molds will be found in certain water damaged environments. So ones that are extra watery, you might find Stachybotrys, whereas ones that might be a bit more on the kind of dry, dusty side, you might be seeing a bit more Aspergillus and Penicillium molds there. But that's not a perfect clear-cut statement. It's just an example. Can mold affect pets? Absolutely. We know that veterinarians and agricultural veterinarians worry about mold and mycotoxins. So much so, the big brands, big dog food brands are always testing for mycotoxins in their dried kibble food. And when there is a recall, of which there is often, it's usually because there's an aflatoxin or ochratoxin or something like that within the food, causing an exposure. So I would say those in the agricultural and veterinarian industries are aware of mycotoxins and mold exposures being problematic to health for animals, but they seem to forget the inhalational component, and I wouldn't even say they seem to forget. When it comes to traditional physicians, even naturopathic physicians, we're not taught much about the inhalational impact of mold in a water damaged building. And if we're not teaching this to our human doctors, then we're most certainly not really teaching it to our animal doctors. The closest things that they might come across might be like brooder houses in chickens that have like a hemorrhagic lung issue or something like that. But, unfortunately, veterinarians are, even though they're well aware that mold and mycotoxins do present health issues, they have been trained in such a way that, unfortunately, they are looking for it to come into the body through a different means. So yes, if you're sick in your home and you have other family members are sick and you notice that, your animals are starting to act sick, whether it's neurological or respiratory. And again, I'm not a veterinarian. So this is not veterinarian advice. It always makes you wonder. It certainly always makes me wonder. And I'm always sure to ask about the health of everyone in the family, including what we so lovingly like to say are fur babies. So yes, mold can absolutely impact pets. Can mold exposure impact sleep? Without a doubt. Mold exposure absolutely can impact sleep. And when I say mold exposure, I need to lump in mycotoxins because that's really, they come together. They don't really exist apart from one another. They might do two slightly different things together because you're looking at one being the overall organism, the overall living unit, and the mycotoxins being what they make, the little bit of toxin that they make. So when we're thinking about insomnia, for instance, or sleep difficulties, mold exposure can cause, difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, inability to wake while rested, maybe bruxism, so grinding of the jaw, severe dreams, like pretty nasty night terrors. That's a lot of impact that mold and mycotoxins can have on your sleep-wake cycles. And that can come from that direct oxidative damage of mycotoxins to the nervous system tissue, to the inflammation within the nervous system, and even to the shift in the hormones that are related to sleep and sleep maintenance. So it's a very, very common symptom of mold exposure, sleep difficulties. What does mold illness look like in the body? I feel like I could do like 10 episodes on this one. So, how I have come to really organize these concepts of mold illness is I think about how it interacts with the body and then how it manifests. Or I should say, I think about where it interacts with the body and then how those symptoms manifest. So, for instance, my first dividing line is the mold interacting with the body outside of the body? The location is in the environment, or is the mold interacting with the person inside of the body, right? So we have external, internal exposure. External is in the environment, internal colonization. It's an overgrowth in your biofilms. Biofilms hopefully sound familiar to you guys. We can always get into it another time. And then what I do is I say, what do the symptoms look like? Are they more allergic? Is there itchy eyes, cough, dry throat, kind of headiness, gritty sand in the eyes, sticky eyes, dry mouth, like any of those symptoms, shortness of breath, sometimes chest tightness. We got to watch out for that one though. Even, bloodshot eyes or itching, swelling, rash. All of those can very much be an allergic reaction or a histaminergic reaction, allergic colic, right? And then there's the toxic reaction. Now, when I think of the toxic reaction, I'm really inferring or referring to mycotoxins, which are, of course, the toxic metabolites that are made from mold. And these toxic metabolites have, I would say, the biggest, most profound impact on the nervous system tissue and the hormonal system. However, with that being said, mycotoxins, what they're really great at is plucking off and moving around electrons on things that are made of fat or rich in fat. The problem is all of our cells have a fatty outer layer. All of the machinery in our cells are made from a fatty structure, right? And then we have a lot of important organs in our body that are really rich in fat. Nervous system, our liver, our kidneys. And then when we think too about the fact that not only all of our cells have that outer layer of fat, but the machinery inside, one of those important parts of machinery are the mitochondria. They have lots of fat, the way their inner membranes are all kind of mixed up and put together. And a lot of the organs and tissues in the body that require a lot of energy have tons of mitochondria. Problem there is that those tissues and those organs that have tons of mitochondria also have tons of fat, which means they are at a higher risk of being damaged by mycotoxins. So, all of that to say, toxic reaction is another way that we see these symptoms manifest in the body. So remember, so far we've said how I kind of organize this concept of what does mold illness look like in the body. We think of it as external or internal, and then we go into what are the symptoms? We already had the allergic-like symptoms. I just told you what the toxic-like symptoms look like. And now there's this generalized inflammatory symptom where, we have immune system dysregulation leading to cell signaling all over the place and immune system dysfunction and these chronic inflammatory issues, chronic immune system dysregulation that just continually lasts. So that's kind of how I break it up. I got your allergic-ish picture. I have your oxidative damage, fatigue, neurological, hormonal picture. And then I have this inflammatory, immune, constant system overwhelm kind of picture. So without going into all the hundreds of symptoms that exist in those classifications, that's really a decent way that you can kind of think about how mold interacts with the body. Can mold grow in cold climates? Yep, absolutely, absolutely. So cold climates might stifle and get mold to slowly decrease its growth, kind of almost go into a rest phase. Even in cold climates, there are still warmer climates that emerge or warmer cycles that emerge where, you can have mold bloom further. So, mold absolutely grows in cold climates, indoors too. Can mold return after remediation? Yes. Yes. So this is one of the biggest issues with remediation is that, you'll talk to someone, you'll say, okay, did you get remediated? What did that look like? And say, oh, yep, I'm done. Remediation's done. It was fine. It was 3 years ago. And you say, okay, well, can we talk about it? They say, no, it's done. And I understand the pushback, But the hard part is maybe something was missed when it was first tested. Maybe part of the remediation failed. Maybe they tore out all the mold stuff, but they didn't actually go back and fix why it was getting some ambient dampness in the first place. Or maybe there's a whole new issue. So yes, can mold return after remediation? Without a doubt. And there are a lot of, from state to state, the concept of remediation is different, especially, for instance, like in certain states, the idea of remediation does not include the correction of the water intrusion. It doesn't include the fixing of the gap on the roof that led to the water coming in, examples like that. So yes, mold can absolutely happen again. Season 2, mold coming to you this fall. Is mold visible or can it be hidden? Can be both. Absolutely can be both. Mold will grow wherever it is allowed to grow, wherever it finds food. Remember, dust, dirt, dander, debris, any type of organic material, even just a little bit of humidity, doesn't have to be tons of standing water and maybe even poor ventilation. Yeah, it'll find a way. And that can be hidden behind a wall. That could be in the deep core of a mattress. It doesn't have to be visible for you to be exposed and feel poorly. Does insurance cover mold damage? This is a big question. And I would say yes and no. The first thing is that you would need something called a mold rider, which means you need to kind of buy a add-on package for your insurance to cover mold damage. But even then, that what we call a rider doesn't necessarily cover the damage due to mold. My understanding is that it covers the hanging of the negative pressure and the bringing in of the air scrubbers. That's realistically what it covers. It's depends on your insurance company, but from what I understand, it is a very difficult process to get personal possessions covered when it comes to mold exposure. So damage due to mold is likely not going to be covered. However, your insurance company, if you do have a mold rider, that realistically just covers the setup of the remediation to address mold rather than your personal possessions. So with that being said, there are insurance companies who claim that they do cover these things. However, there's also the awareness that the water has to come into the house in through a certain means in order to be considered for a mold coverage. So if it comes in from the ground up, that's a flood, unless you have flood insurance, which is very expensive, it likely won't be covered. However, if it comes, from the sky down, in instances where maybe, wind blows or rain in and around your chimney or in your windows or things like that, then maybe there might be a claim there. However, if it is a slow, damp, leaking pipe that, has been going on for quite some time, there is a decreased likelihood of coverage, because what will often happen is it will come back on the homeowner saying, well, you need to take responsibility as a homeowner to make sure that any water intrusion gets addressed within X amount of hours. This issue has been going on for so-and-so amount of days, therefore we will deny it. So, there's a lot of ins and outs to this, to be very clear. And it's going to vary from insurance to insurance. I've seen some homeowners insurance that have been amazing with people. And then I've seen others not so much. One thing that you might want to consider if you find yourself navigating this is working with something called a public adjuster. These folks are there to help in the process of representation, and look into them, do a little bit of digging. You might see that they're worthwhile for you. What is the difference between air filtration and purification? I think of filtration as a net, like you're working on catching something in a net and you're letting the air pass through. Whereas purification I think a bit more about this oxidative form of air cleaning. And so what happens here, or there's a few different forms of this purification. When I think purification, I think of, destruction or complete removal or something along these lines. So different from filtration, almost like breaking things down to their lowest atom structure, right? So there are some air purification units that will use something called photooxidation that will flash a bright light on a reactive surface. And as the molecules float through the filter or through the purification unit, that bright light just essentially explodes it down to its smallest amount, which would be your carbon and water, you know. But here's the kicker. There are units that claim that they can do that, and that maybe the air moves through too quickly, or maybe the surface isn't as reactive as it should be. So you have one mold fragment going through that oxidative process, and it's getting damaged, and you want it to explode down into nothingness, down into CO2 and water, right? But instead, it explodes down into millions of smaller, more minute fragments that can cause severe health concerns. So I now, and now here we are, because when you know better, you do better. I now caution people to learn as much as they can about the photooxidation or purification air units that they will be employing. I lean a little bit more now towards the hyper HEPA and kind of 10-pound charcoal combo. So you get the adsorbing with the charcoal, and then the extreme HEPA filtration, keeping on top of those and changing them as often as possible. But yeah, there is a difference between these two technologies, and it's very important that you choose a product that demonstrates the claims that they make. Are mold and mildew the same? Yeah, they are. And usually, if you have someone that you're coming to, they're saying, "Hey, I think there's a mold issue," and go, "No, that's mold. That's not mold. That's mildew." You either got one of two things on your hands. You either have someone who's looking to mislead you, and they know what it actually is, or you have someone who doesn't actually understand what they're dealing with. Both of them can be problematic to deal with and potentially dangerous to your health. Can mold exposure affect mental health? Absolutely. And here's why. Not only do you have the experience, the stressful and traumatic experience of having your home be a threat to your health, your personal items being a threat to your health. Maybe friends and family don't understand, like the whole being sick, being out of work, the whole entire process of just the experience of it can impact mental health. But then we have that inflammatory and oxidative damage component that happens with mold and mycotoxin exposure. And those two things can really throw your neurotransmitters out of whack, can cause anxiety, depression. I've seen a whole lot worse too, frankly. But yes, absolutely. We see that mold and mycotoxin exposure can absolutely cause mental health issues. Can mold exposure cause fatigue? Yes, mold exposure can absolutely cause fatigue. And there are many different reasons why. They can, mold and mycotoxin exposure can interfere with the absorption of nutrients that are needed to have good energy metabolism. They interfere with your ability to sleep, right? So that's going to impact your fatigue. They interfere with your mitochondria, which are your powerhouses of your cells that are needed to just get up and move through your life. They're very dense in your skeletal tissue. They're very dense in your nervous system. So you could have physical fatigue, You could have brain fog, fatigue, many different forms of fatigue can manifest. And until you've actually gone through what it is to be fatigued, and I mean this so respectfully, you don't understand. You never knew how tired you could be on how many fronts. Like, it's mind boggling. So absolutely, mold exposure can cause fatigue through many different means. Can mold exposure lead to weight changes? Absolutely. And I think of this in two different classifications. I think of kind of the fatty tissue weight gain, and then I think of fluid retention weight gain. So fatty tissue weight gain, you can develop this from endocrine disruption from mold and mycotoxin exposure. So you're shifting your thyroid functionality, your cortisol levels, all of those things, your leptin levels, those can all be impacted by mold exposure. However, when you are sick and you're mold exposed and your immune system is running haywire around the body, trying to control whatever is happening, the immune system rides through the body on fluid between the cells. And so what ends up happening is a lot of people will get puffy, they'll gain weight, but it won't be that denser, fattier tissue. Instead, it'll be like puffy water weight. And that happens when people are inflamed, when they're going into a histaminergic crisis, when they're, just all out immune system chaos is reigning, essentially. That's the easiest way to put it. I'm so sorry. But yeah, so we do see a weight gain with that. And so we have, again, that fatty tissue weight gain, which I don't frankly see as often. Instead, what I tend to see with mold exposure and mold reactivity is more of that inflammatory, wet, swelling, edema weight gain. What is the connection between mold exposure and headaches? There's a huge one there, of course. Of course there is, right? Now, mold exposure and headaches. You could develop a mold-induced headache from too much histamine. You could develop a mold exposure headache from too much glutamate, from oxidative damage to the nervous system tissue, from changes in blood flow because of mold and mycotoxin exposure, to neurotransmitter shifts, to nutrient shifts. There's so many different reasons why you can have headaches develop. And the hormones are another big one. So, mold exposure can absolutely cause headaches for folks, without a doubt. Can mold exposure lead to hormone imbalances? Yes, absolutely. And there are a few ways that can do it. Mold and mycotoxin exposure can cause difficulties with breakdown of hormones. They can cause changes in creation of hormones. They can block the hormone signal, or they can even stimulate the hormone signal. So they really just have their hands in all pots here. And so we can see problems as a result with estrogen and progesterone and testosterone, and then their relationship to one another, and your cortisol and your thyroid hormones. I mean, pretty much all hormones can be impacted in some way, shape, or form by mold and mycotoxin exposure. And as a result, the symptoms and the effects are so far-reaching. I mean, libido, early onset puberty, perimenopausal symptoms that just drag out, menstrual irregularities, thyroid conditions, the list realistically goes on and on. So yes, we do see hormonal impacts with mold and mycotoxin exposure. Can mold exposure impact children differently than adults? And hey, I would say it's not necessarily that it's impacting children differently. Although, yes, they have kind of different hormones, I would say, at different times in their life. So you could have different impacts on their development, neurological and growth, for sure. We'll give them that. But there is this component where children present differently simply because of their differences in how they move through their life and how they interact with their body. So, for instance, a child might have difficulty saying, like, man, I am having brain fog today. Or, like, my muscles feel weak and sore and I am very tired. Or I am having indigestion right now with sharp liver pain. Like kids don't have, so instead it's my tummy hurts, or they are acting up in school and it seems like they have a flare in their ADHD or something like that. So in general with children, some of the more reported symptoms are headache. Kids tend to be able to convey headache pretty well. Their head hurts. Additionally, you might see behavioral issues in school manifest and poke through. And then the other one could potentially be um, some of their digestive issues. Digestive issues, definitely for kiddos. So, yeah, it's not that they're too different from adults. It's just their concept of self and then how they convey it is different. So it manifests slightly different when it comes to reporting clinically. Can mold exposure cause allergies? Yes. Mold exposure can absolutely cause allergies, of course, to mold, and also to their mycotoxins too. But there are some studies that show that exposure to mold can cause allergic-like reaction or immune system confusion enough that a body might have what looks like an allergic reaction to something that it's never seen before. Now, this is something that's pretty rare because usually the whole definition of an allergy involves this concept of like a previous exposure, an initiating exposure. And so there are a couple of studies that show that mold exposure has resulted in folks who develop allergies to, say, something that they've never seen before, they've never interacted with. So, like a child developing a allergic reaction to horse dander, but they've never been in a stable in all their life. So we definitely do see that. Now, to further that kind of, I would say, immune system confusion on that allergy front. So we can have like develop an allergy to something that our body may not have seen before. We can develop an allergy to the mold. But then we can also develop a reactivity to the things that our body has tolerated before. And so that's something else to consider. And usually a lot of folks who end up seeking help have gone on to develop such severe allergies, or I really just classify them as histaminergic reactions because they're not a true allergy. They've gone on to develop such histaminergic reactions that like they can't even eat anymore. I call it they've eaten themselves into a corner. They literally can only tolerate like 2 or 3 foods. And so usually these folks are also navigating mast cell activation disorder. So yeah, it's a lot. They're usually navigating mast cell activation syndrome, MCAS. Can mold exposure cause joint pain? Yes. In general, mold mycotoxin exposure can result in systemic inflammation, and that systemic inflammation can cause joint pain, muscle pain. It can look a lot like Lyme. It can have that wandering pain. But something that we also see here too, in theory, is people who have this allergic-like symptom where they also swell too. We worry about immune system cells getting caught in that swelling around joints and tissues. And those immune cells that are trapped then secreting essentially proteolytic enzymes, protein digesting enzymes that might further break down some of this connective tissue in and around those joints. And so there is a little bit of a working theory here that we see in the complex chronic illness world. But we worry that folks who tend to be a little bit more histaminergic or live in that mast cell world might have connective tissue disorder issues, connective tissue issues, that could result in more severe joint pain than if they didn't have MCAS. It's a really interesting concept. Can mold exposure cause respiratory issues? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we know that our mucosa, which is a really soft, supple tissue that can be really easily damaged, lines our mouth, our sinuses, our lungs, all of our internal hollow tubes. And any type of mold particulates can absolutely bump into these tissues and cause local irritation. And then that can look like coughing, it can look like postnasal drip, it can look like dry mouth, it can look like sinus pressure. It can look like chest tightness. Again, always be careful with the chest tightness. It can look like asthma. You can go to a pulmonologist and they'll have you go through the testing and they'll say, well, it sounds like asthma, but then on your test, it doesn't look like asthma. I will give you an inhaler anyway. And so usually what we see with mold exposed people is they get assigned this like concept of like non-classical asthma that's also non-responsive to the treatment interventions that people typically get for asthma. So yes, can mold issues cause respiratory problems? For sure. And it's definitely a process to try to pick it apart and tease it out. Can mold exposure affect vision? Absolutely. When people are mold exposed, they might have issues with almost like color differentiating or contrast differentiating, or even like tracking things, or like blurring of vision. So one of the things I always ask people is, did your focal point change? So you'll have your phone here, and then 5 minutes later it's out here, and then all of a sudden it's back again. There's a lot of different things that can happen with mold exposure and its impact on vision. And some of it can be a bit more of like a histamine reaction at the front of the eye. And some of it can be more of a neurological reaction due to the toxins at I would say, the back of the eye, the retina, the optic nerve, and in the visual processing centers of the brain. Can mold exposure lead to hair loss? Yes. And unfortunately, hair loss is usually the last thing to happen. And it's also usually the last thing to repair. And this can occur through autoimmune reactions that are mediated by mold. It can occur through direct fungal colonization of the scalp. It could even occur through interference with nutrient absorption due to mold exposures. My gosh, the list goes on and on. Hormonal shifts due to mold exposures. There's a lot of different ways that hair loss can be impacted. I mean, the stress of undergoing mold and mycotoxin exposure. So, yes, it can impact the hair, and it can be a while until I always usually say, like, the hair feels safe enough to return. Perfect, guys. I'm trying. So, can mold exposure worsen pre-existing conditions? Yes. So if there's a weakness in the body, there's going to be a predilection for that to get worse for folks. So if someone already has, I would say, heart disease, then being exposed to mold and mycotoxins having a big impact on cardiac functioning, that person might have a worsening of blood pressure, or they might have more rapid swings in heart rate. It's realistically, and I think this goes in general for anything. Usually the things that are the weakest in the body are the ones that are going to take the brunt of the damage when something big happens. So especially if it's systemic, meaning it's delivered body-wide. So yes, what we can see is that mold and mycotoxin exposure can absolutely worsen someone's pre-existing conditions. Can mold exposure cause nausea? Absolutely. And this can happen through many different means. It could be a colonization in the posterior throat, the sinuses dripping down the back of the throat into the stomach, causing nausea. It could be a central nervous system inflammation issue that's causing the nausea. It could be a local GI colonization, dysbiosis causing the nausea. My goodness, the list goes on and on. So absolutely, nausea is one of the more common things, more common symptoms that we see with mold exposure. Can mold exposure cause skin problems? Yes. And I usually think about it from two perspectives. I think about it as the skin issue kind of coming from the outside or the skin issue coming from the inside. So, coming from the outside, it could be like local topical irritation from having mold in the environment. Or if it's coming from the inside, you could have an overload of the toxins causing immune system dysfunction at the level of the skin, leading to like psoriatic like lesions, eczema, things like that. So, yeah, absolutely. Mold and mycotoxin exposure can cause skin issues. What should you do if you suspect mold in your home? The first thing you should do is pause, take a beat, and step back. The worst things that I see people do at this time when they do find mold in their home is to panic. The likelihood that the mold has been there for some time is high, and you acting so quickly as to try to make a brash decision on what to do within a day is likely not going to make anything happen any faster. However, it could cause a lot of issues downstream. When you're dealing with mold in the home, there's so many things to think through and to decide and to research. And the first step forward realistically involves finding an IEP, an indoor environmental professional, who can come and do very thorough testing for you. Because then they develop the remediation plan. And then you have to research a remediation company to fulfill that remediation plan. And then you get the IEP back in to do testing after the remediation. And then after you're out of exposure, you can then go work on yourself and take care of yourself. But to misorder these steps or to bring the wrong person on the team can set you back months, years, and can set you back just so so profoundly through financial means. You want to make sure that you're doing something right the first time, and rushing and making panic decisions from this limbic reactive space, it's not the way you do it. And I understand. This is why I'm answering these questions. I understand wholeheartedly. I'm just like, I just gotta get the thing done. And you have mold brain, you're freaking out. You want to make it right. You want to feel safe in your day. And so the thing you do is you take action, right? And that's also histamine talking because it's neuroexcitatory. It's telling you to go. It's telling you you're in a fight or flight. You're threatened. You have to fight back. You got to run away from the bear. You got to fight back. Stop. You need to step away from the situation. You need to ground yourself, and you need to figure out what the next steps are. And that's the whole point of this podcast. I'm going to be interviewing some indoor environmental professionals throughout this season and doing a really awesome Q&A where we cover so much of this stuff. So it's going to be really important for you to also subscribe, follow, do all that good stuff so you don't miss those episodes, because there's going to be so much good information there for you. So please, when you find mold in your home, you almost need to do this non-attachment. Know what is. You're like, that is mold. That is a problem. I need sleep. And I can start to figure out how to deal with this tomorrow. And really setting yourself up for that expectation of moving slowly in a metered and measured manner is going to save you so much time, so much stress. And I just wish I could tell this to everyone that I encounter. a handful of people listen, and they always end up coming back and being, thank you so much. And then there's other people who I say it, I share it, they go up into the ether, and I never know, what they end up doing about it. But please know that, I have no skin in the game to tell you to move slowly. I've only seen that rushing in these situations can be profoundly problematic for folks. How can mold exposure impact memory? And this is another great question. So, of course, as I've mentioned numerous times, you've had the severe and dysregulating impact of the trauma of the experience of being ill, of losing your home, social difficulties with people in your life. But that can be, of course, impactful on memory. However, we also know that mold and mycotoxin exposure can cause neuroinflammation, oxidative damage, changes in blood flow, changes in hormones, changes in cell-to-cell signaling, many different things. The way the brain processes and stores information, including short-term and long-term memory. So we do know that there is a connection between mold exposure, mycotoxin exposure, and memory. So much so, we see this in work of Dr. Dale Bredesen and his developed concept of inhalational Alzheimer's. So, of course, mold and mycotoxins can absolutely cause issues around memory. Usually in my practice, what I see, it's usually short-term memory was the one that people struggle with the most. And it can be really insidious of, having to use more Post-it notes, or I can never remember the last 4 digits of the phone number that I was trying to remember, or, I can't remember the code that gets sent to my phone for 2-factor authentication or something like that. So, and of course it gets worse the longer it goes on. But all of that to say that, yes, absolutely, mold and mycotoxin exposure can completely impact memory. How does mold exposure cause sensory sensitivities? So I want to preface this by saying there are sensory sensitivities that people can, of course, experience with mold exposure, or this like heightened sensory experience. But there's also sensory dampening that can happen, where people will struggle with their ability to, engage deep enough in their senses. So, for instance, some people for a heightened or overstimulated sensory experience, they might be sensitive to touch or to light or to sound, whereas some folks might have a decreased sensory experience around taste, smell. They might even have a decreased sensory experience around like ability to distinguish color or tracking things. So there's a lot of things that can happen from a sensory perspective. And those are just your basic senses. There's also these 2 kind of lesser known senses that are just as important, one called proprioception and one called interoception. Interoception is this sense of being in your body, your emotions, your heart rate, your hunger signals, those types of things. Whereas your proprioceptive sense is where you are in space. Now, most people don't spend too much time thinking about these things. They're so knee-jerk and automatic. But people who are neurodivergent might realize that when they're mold exposed, not only do they have these changes, could be increases or dampening of their sensory experience of all the, common senses that we've listed off, but also of proprioceptive senses and interoceptive senses. So they might have even more of an issue of being present in their body. They might have more of an issue tracking hunger or fatigue, or maybe their increased sensory sensitivity to smell might worsen their experience of chemical sensitivities. So all of that to say, if you are mold exposed and you're finding that Your sensory experiences are either sharpened, heightened, or dulled. It's all very validating. It does happen with these types of exposures. Can mold exposure cause cardiovascular issues? Once again, I would say yes, but I want to call into people's perspective the idea that cardiovascular issues don't stop at the heart. They go out to systemic circulation. So in this discussion, not only do we have to talk about how mold and mycotoxin exposure can be directly toxic to the heart cells, but we also know that these toxins can cause issues with fluid balance, the ability for the blood vessels to control blood pressure, either causing too high of a blood pressure, too low of a blood pressure. We also know that mycotoxins in circulation can damage the blood vessel lining, leading to some of that leaky blood vessel picture, which can lead to more swelling for folks. And of course, mixed in with all of this, I would say, is this concept of POTS, or postural orthostatic tachycardic syndrome. And this is when people get lightheaded when moving from seated to standing, their heart races, and they kind of nearly black out. This is all part of that cardiovascular picture that we can see for people who are mold and mycotoxin exposed. Doesn't necessarily mean that it all has to happen to every person, but we have to remember that that cardiovascular system is so wide-reaching. And this isn't even dialoguing about the idea of what we call a hypercoagulable state, meaning your blood gets thick. And when your blood gets thick, you don't carry oxygen and nutrients as well to the cells that need it. And you don't carry waste away as well. So there's a lot that can happen in and around the cardiovascular system, and it just doesn't stop at the heart. So yes, can absolutely impact the cardiovascular system. Well, everybody, that's it. We made it through too many questions. Way too many, but I had a great time answering them, and hopefully you had a great time learning. I have a feeling that these questions will just lay the foundation for more questions to come. So it wouldn't surprise me that there's like a season 2 intro episode, maybe even, where I answer even more of the more common questions, or maybe less common questions about mold exposure and mold illness from my perspective. And so I'm super happy to have had you here with me. I do hope you learned something, and I encourage you to like, follow, subscribe, etc. So that way you can track me in this season as I interview some amazing guests, and you get to see us firsthand bring all these different fields together that maybe someone wouldn't have seen a through line. But the through line is mold, and it's going to be so exciting. And I'm so happy to have you there with me. So you can head on over to my website, lifeaftermold.com, for more information. You can find me across all social media channels at lifeaftermold. And when you head over to my website, feel free to sign up for my newsletter. And when you do, you will get access to my free ebook, Mold Prevention 101, which will help you kind of keep tabs on the things you have to think about when it comes to preventing mold in your home. So with that being said, thank you so much for joining me, and I am so excited for what's in store. Thank you for tuning in to the Life After Mold podcast. If you want access to my Mold Prevention 101 free ebook, all you have to do is sign up for my newsletter. It's chock full of information about what you can do to protect yourself and your home from water damage. So head on over to my website, lifeaftermold.com, for access.